All right, everybody, it's finally time to have a chat about the all important Azure resource hierarchy. We've got a good understanding now of how we can set up an Azure environment. We can have an Azure AD tenant and we can set up a subscription. We know there are a range of different services we can deploy. And within this lesson, we're going to talk about the various building blocks that we'll use to actually deploy our solutions. So, first things first, we'll talk about management infrastructure. That's just a fancy way of saying the different building blocks that we can use when we're deploying our solutions to Azure. Then we'll also talk about what that looks like from top to bottom by discussing the resource hierarchy. And finally, we'll talk through some design considerations for how you can put all of this together. Okay, first things first, let's have a chat about resources. What is a resource? It's the most fundamental building block within Azure. Well, a resource is just something that you deploy to Azure. So you might be working with virtual networks, firewalls, maybe a web application, or even a virtual machine. Whenever you deploy any of these things to Azure, that's called a resource. So let's say we deployed 4 virtual machines to Azure. That would mean that we have 4 resources within Azure. A single instance of a given service like a virtual machine, web app, database, or any other Azure service is called a resource. So let's say we're just deploying one virtual machine. Now, when we go ahead and do that, we create a resource that is the virtual machine type. And really importantly, it has a range of different properties that we're going to configure depending on what service we are deploying. Now, whatever service you do deploy, you're always going to have a name for your resource and a location. Just like we spoke about earlier, that might be an Azure region that you deploy your service to. For the different resources that you create within Azure, you'll also have a range of other properties depending on the service that you are configuring. A virtual machine might need to know the image that you want to deploy, the size in terms of the CPU and memory you're going to have, and you'll also need some other resources to help this virtual machine out. For example, you're going to attach an operating system disk that provides the storage for your virtual machine. You'll also want to provide network connectivity using a network interface card. The key point here is that when we create our resource, depending on the type of resource that we're actually creating, we'll also have a range of other properties that we need to configure as well. And when we do so, we're going to use those Azure management tools that we walked through earlier. Azure CLI, the portal, PowerShell, maybe even a software development kit if you're developing your own solution to go and deploy resources within Azure for you. The whole point here is that when you pick a service you want to go and create in Azure, you create it as a resource. So let's say we want to create this resource, a virtual machine called VM1. A really important thing you also need to know about within Azure is that when you create this resource, you have to do so within something called a resource group. Every single resource you create within Azure has to be created within a resource group. This is something that you deploy your resources to. You can't have one resource that belongs to multiple different resource groups. It's kind of like this box that you drop your resource into, and that's it. It's not shared across multiple resource groups. There's just one resource group that you deploy a resource to. Now, you can, of course, have lots of different resources within a single resource group, and you might also have lots and lots of different resource groups within a single subscription. So you might be wondering, well, how do I decide how many resource groups I create? Do I just create one big resource group for all of my different resources? And no, that's definitely not commonly the case. Normally what you'll be doing is creating a resource group and adding in there all the different resources that kind of work together. All of the related resources that share the same life cycle. So a virtual machine might have a virtual network, a virtual machine disk, and maybe some other resources like backup that you want to have all within a single resource group. It's really up to you how you choose to do that, whether you have one resource that's in there or a whole different range of related resources that are all deployed to the same resource group. Now, a final bit of information just to know about resource groups is that the resource group itself is really like a management box, a boundary, a container, a thing that you store your resources within. The resource group itself doesn't really contain any data. It just contains metadata. For example, it has a list of the resources that exist within it and some information about the deployments that have taken place to put those resources there. So for example, we might have virtual machine 1 with a name of VM1, and it might be deployed to a location of West US. Now, when we deploy that virtual machine to this resource group, that resource group will track some information about the deployment that took place. Also, just bear in mind that yes, that resource group has a name, and it also actually has a location as well. That location is just going to determine where that basic metadata is stored. But you'll see here, it doesn't actually influence the location of the resources within the resource group itself. So I could have this virtual machine, VM1, based in the West US region, and I could have the actual resource group itself stored within Central US. I could have several other different resources as well. Maybe I've got a database in there that's in Australia. Maybe there's some other services deployed to India. They could all exist within this same resource group, even though the resource group itself is in a different location. So now that we know that we deploy resources to a resource group, it's also important to just call out that we can use these different boundaries for administration and management purposes. So for example, I might use a resource group to help out with deployment of a range of associated and related resources. I might also use the resource group as a way for saying, who am I going to allow access to administer, manage, create, configure all of these resources within the resource group. And finally, resource groups can also help out with tracking of billing because we can go and get a breakdown of the billing based on the resources within the resource group. Now, this is all going to be really high level at this stage, so don't worry too much about it. Just understand that as we move throughout the different types of building blocks that we can use, you're going to come to learn that there are different features that we can apply at different levels. So we've got that virtual machine, we want to deploy it, we've created a resource group called VM1-RG that we're going to deploy that resource to. Where is that resource group going to exist? Well, it's going to sit within the subscription that we have created for our Azure environment. The Azure subscription is going to contain all of your resources, all of your resource groups that you want to deploy, that you want to configure and use for your various solutions. Now, you might at this stage think, okay, I'm going to work with Azure. I'm just going to create one single subscription. I'm going to place a range of different resource groups and resources in there, all for my own requirements. But just understand, it is actually quite common for organizations to have multiple different subscriptions containing all their different resources. For example, if we work for a global organization, we actually might want to create various different subscriptions for each of the different geographies that our organization works in. Maybe we're going to have a subscription for India, for Europe, for America, whatever it might be that matches our organization. Or we might want to match it up to something different, like the environments that we use, such as production, development, and so on. Really, it's going to be up to you, but it's quite common to see these subscriptions deployed in a way that mirrors the actual setup of the organization itself. And we do that because just like resource groups, we can actually use these for a boundary for things like automation, security, billing, and much more. So if you do want to use multiple different subscriptions for your organization, just bear in mind it's really quite common to have one single Azure AD tenant and to have all of those subscriptions associated with that tenant so that it matches your environment with one single identity source. So let's say, for example, that we did want to set up a production subscription and we also wanted to set up a development subscription. What we would want to do if that matched our organization is make sure that it shares the same Azure AD tenant. Now, if we did have lots and lots of different subscriptions, it's important to know that there is one other layer that we can go ahead and configure, and that's something called a management group. Now, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources are all pretty much mandatory. If you want to deploy services to Azure, you're going to need those three things. However, management groups aren't something that you have to use. They are just a tool that is available to you if you've got multiple subscriptions and you want to more easily manage them. All right, everybody, we've now walked through all of the different building blocks that we can use to deploy our solutions in Azure. Let's just quickly recap what that looks like from the top to the bottom. At the top, we can have our management groups, and if you are going to use these, just understand there is something called a root management group that does exist by default. But what you could choose to do is create additional management groups to match your organization. Maybe you're going to have a management group for India and one for Australia. Now within that, you could have your different subscriptions that you use across your organization. And we use those management groups to help us to better organize, manage, control security, and lots of other features as well. So your environment might look like this. Now, within our subscriptions, we know that when we deploy our solutions, we're going to need those resource groups and resources as well. So if you're looking at this and thinking, why do we use all of these different layers? Well, I can assure you that this is something that becomes much more clear as you continue your journey working with Azure. Generally speaking, you're going to have this all set up, ready to go to mirror what you have for your organization. And when we use it in the real world, it's going to help out with things like applying security policies. So maybe India and Australia have different security rules. We could apply those at the management group level and have them filter down to the subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. Or maybe you just want to use this sort of hierarchy to better understand billing. Well, you could do that as well. And as another example, we could use things like resource groups to better control the deployments of our solution. Really, again, as I say, these are just the building blocks, and how you use them is going to depend on what you're trying to achieve and the way in which your organization is structured. So, some final things to consider. First things first, I would say there's no magic answer in terms of how you actually go and set up all of this hierarchy. It's really up to you, up to your organization, and it's going to depend on what you're trying to achieve with things such as Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure Policy, automation, and much more other features that you'll learn about as you continue your journey with Azure. Just understand that for a range of these different features, when you apply them at the higher levels of the resource hierarchy, they do actually tend to inherit and apply from the top to the bottom. Also, in terms of how you want to structure your subscriptions, you might want to bear in mind that there are limits that are imposed at the subscription level. So for example, there might be a maximum number of storage accounts, virtual machines, databases, and other services that you can deploy. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, you might actually want to use those subscriptions to help you work within those limits. As I have also mentioned, whatever automation tool you're using, you're commonly going to see your solutions being deployed to resource groups. It is possible to distribute your solutions across multiple resource groups, but oftentimes deployments themselves are kind of associated on a deployment to resource group basis. Also, in terms of resource groups, bear in mind that if you want to delete one, that's going to delete all of the resources within that resource group. So that might change how you want to architect the resource hierarchy as well. And finally, whilst we have walked through some examples now of a complex hierarchy with a range of different subscriptions where you can control these policies from the top down, just know that there are different features that you can apply on a per resource level as well. So if we wanted to say that someone could only access a given virtual machine, we could in fact apply that security at the individual virtual machine level. But that's not commonly recommended, and it can cause some difficulties in terms of management. More often than not, what you're going to see is permissions, standards, and other configuration being applied at higher levels like the resource group, subscription, or management groups. So folks, that's a quick walkthrough of the different building blocks that we can use when we're working with Azure. It might sound very high level right now, but I can assure you as you continue your journey working with Azure, all of this will become second nature. So thanks once again for joining me, folks. That's a wrap.